Okay, a couple of weeks ago we left off about halfway through Revelation chapter 14. We've talked about the Lamb and the 144,000. This is verses 1 on through verse 5. Describes a little bit of the character of these 144,000. We've taught before, we've established before from back in chapter 7, that these 144,000 are those who are the faithful of the Lord on earth at any given time. Not that there's literally 144,000 at any given time. It's a number that is comprised of some of these numbers we find in Revelation 10 and 12, and kind of a repeating pattern of showing this completion, this completeness of character. And certainly that number is representative of these people who have given themselves to the service of Jehovah. And as Jesus called on the churches of Asia, be faithful unto death. And this is what they're willing to do in the face of persecution. And so that's who is under consideration, verses 1 through 5. This is not considering that they're not, as we notice here in verse 1, how that here's Jesus standing with his 144,000 on Mount Zion. But this isn't in heaven. This isn't as if all of a sudden now this is a heavenly scene. But rather, this is that spiritual Mount Zion is not literal heaven. It's that recognition of Hebrews chapter 12, or Hebrews chapter 12. Yeah, that's right. Where you didn't come to Mount Sinai, this mountain that shook with fire and all the people were afraid. You've come to Mount Zion. This is the church of the firstborn. This is where you are, the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 12. So it's not that we're literally in heaven, and these 144,000 aren't literally in heaven. It's they're being taken care of and guided by Jesus. They've come to Mount Zion where Jesus is. They want to be where he is and let him lead them. And then as a result of that, and of course, as we noted, some of the specifics regarding the characteristics of these individuals, it's especially in light of the idolatry that existed and was kind of part and parcel of the Roman Empire. This worship of the false gods of Greeks and Romans, as well as the worship of the Caesars, the emperor worship. And these individuals, these 144,000, they were pure. They did not serve these false gods. They served the one true God. And there's some different characteristics also associated with this, but they don't have any blemish. They're pure before the sight of God. But then, kind of separate from this, so here's the saved of God who have given themselves over to serving him no matter what persecution comes. But then in verse 6, all of a sudden you have these three angels being referenced, starting in verse 6. And this is happening kind of almost as an aside. So there's the 144,000, and they're being taken care of and guided by Jesus. They're giving themselves to serving him. Meanwhile, while they are kind of off doing that, despite the fact that they're still in society, they're still being persecuted, they're facing trials every single day, in the spirit, in their mind and hearts, that's where they are. They're on Mount Zion with Jesus. But meanwhile, God continues to be active. And remember, we've taught before, going back to chapter 11, 12, and 13, that the temptation for some of these saints to feel like God's plan has somehow been derailed. Roman Empire seeking to persecute and try to destroy the church, destroy Christians. It's as if the plan of God has been kind of cast aside. And one of the messages of these chapters is that God's plan is never derailed. Nothing man can do can derail the plan of God. God will use and utilize man's choices, whether they be good or evil, to still bring about what his will is. But his will still be done, and nothing that man does can change that. That being the case, here in verse 6, John says, I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven, having eternal good tidings to proclaim unto them that dwell on the earth, and unto every nation and tribe and tongue and people. This good news, or gospel, as the New King James renders it, this gospel of, and notice some of the specifics in verse 7 is going to be here, but we associate the good news with salvation. And certainly that needs to be associated here as well. But that is part of this good news. But notice the angle, notice the means by which this is being done, verse 7. It's being said with a great voice, fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made the heaven and the earth and sea and fountains of water. So what aspect of God, or what kind of view of God is this angel proclaiming this good news? God as what? Creator. Okay, that stands in contrast to the idolatry that was part and parcel of Roman life in society. This is how they lived, and they worshiped their gods. It was part of their everyday life, the libations they would pour out in their businesses and things like that, the association with the guilds. That was part of their daily life. And here is the message of the gospel being taught, not by an angel per se, but this is this being kind of referenced in this gospel message being spread out through the whole empire, that Jehovah is God. And you link that to what he said at Mars Hill, and how that he addressed this unknown God. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of the embodiment of what's happening here in verse 7. The same thing that Paul did in addressing this unknown God and contrasting this unknown God to all these other gods. This is the one true God. In him we live and move and have our being. He's the one who's created all things. In him he has appointed a day in which all will be judged. How interesting it is that message that Paul gave at Mars Hill is almost mirrored here in verse 7. Long after Paul ever preached that lesson, that's being mirrored here in verse 7. God is the God of heaven and earth. He is the creator. He will bring forth judgment on all those who do not obey him. And that's exactly what's being described in verse 7. But it's being described as good news. Because, yes, there is judgment to come, but God has provided a way, a means, an avenue of salvation. And that's the good news. That's the glorious aspect of the gospel. Anything through verse 7?
All nations would be blessed. The tribes and tongues, especially beginning Acts 2, you see that of all the people with all the different tongues.
Yeah, no, you're
spreading of the gospel.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, and notice that this spread of the gospel is because it's universal in its nature. It's also going to be universal in the sense of it's not just to a specific people in time either. Okay, we're talking about a specific period of time in the sense of these brethren going through for these 250 years or so persecution by the hands of the Roman Empire. But it's not going to be just specific to that time frame. And this is part of the reason why Revelation continues to be relevant. It continues to provide applications for us. Is that first of all, has God's word, what God views as right and wrong, has it changed in 2,000 years? No. No, it hasn't changed. The applications of right and wrong as technology comes along, it all boils down to the same stuff. Satan may dress it up in different ways. He may dress it up in availability of temptation through technology and through TV, things like that, but it stays the same. It's still the same basic concepts that have always been. The devil's going to use those devices, those wiles, to try to trap us. And God has given us the means to overcome that. And that remains universal. And even if God allows this world to continue for another 2,000 years, is it going to change? No, it's not going to change. Man still remains the same nature that man has. Remember we talked Wednesday night, it was Wednesday night, about how the flesh is not inherently sinful. It's not that we have original sin inherited from Adam, and it's not that we have to sin because Jesus didn't sin. But is flesh and blood, does it have inherent weakness to the sins of the flesh? Sure it does. And because of that, the same types of temptations are going to take place in the minds of men, and the devil's going to use the same things. That's part of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10. Okay, no temptation has overtaken you such as is common to man, verse 13, I think it is. But God, because he knows that we're susceptible to temptation, he will never, ever allow us to be tempted beyond what we're able to bear. But with the temptation, he'll make a what? A way of escape. A way of escape. So the fact that Paul, and that's in the context of looking back at Israel and what Israel had gone through, verses 1 through 7 there of 1 Corinthians 10, he says, nothing's changed. No temptation has overtaken you as is common to man. This is something man has dealt with since the beginning of time. And we talked about Adam and Eve and the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life that she went through kind of in her mind in viewing the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That hasn't changed. It's still around. Nothing new has been added to the formula. Now, verse 7, he says with a great voice, fear God and give him glory. And of course, Solomon emphasizes that fear is the beginning of what? Wisdom. Wisdom, especially in context of what Solomon is describing, the beginning of godly wisdom, which is the only wisdom that really matters. Wisdom of how to please God, how to serve him. Fear is the beginning of that wisdom. And Solomon constantly contrasts, both in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, those who fear God and are wise versus those who don't fear God and are foolish. And those who don't fear God and are foolish, they give themselves over to things exactly like what's being described here in chapter 14. Things of Satan, whether it's through idolatry, kind of appealing to the lusts of the flesh and things like that. That's how Satan utilizes, that's how he works through temptations. But, as we noted, verse 8, a second angel followed, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, that has made all the nations to drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Now here in context, the term fornication isn't really being used literally, it's being used figuratively in the sense of this idolatry. Remember, it's not literal Babylon either. We looked before about how the Roman Empire was described in a couple different ways. Egypt, it was described as Jerusalem, it was described as Babylon. And there's been a couple references to the great city. Well, this is almost identical. It's almost verbatim what Isaiah says literally about Babylon. But notice in Isaiah, it was Isaiah 21, I think it was, verse 9. Isaiah prophesied and he said, Babylon is fallen. But do you remember how many years it was that Isaiah said that before Babylon actually fell? About 200 years. But as far as God's plan was concerned, it was already done. Okay, there was no turning back. It was done. And as a result, and it's kind of the similar when we see Jesus, there's a couple times that he references kind of things that were going to happen in the future as if they had already happened, specifically him sacrificing himself and laying down his life and so forth. There's a couple times where he uses kind of the future tense as if it were present tense. But it's because as far as he's concerned, as far as his purpose and his determination, it's done. It's not, I'm not going to leave it undone. This is the Father's will, and I'm going to do it. And it's interesting because Ray Summers, in his commentary on this particular verse, talking about the kind of, it's more of a kind of academic with regard to the way the Greek is used. He says the aorist used is the constative aorist, which looks upon the entire process of Rome's fall as one momentary act of falling. So certain is the fall in the mind of God that it is looked upon as already having taken place. And that's exactly the same as Isaiah 21. In fact, that's kind of the idea of why it's being used here in verse 8. I don't think it's an accident that it's almost verbatim what Isaiah said. Because it's referencing something that's not going to happen tomorrow, and it's not going to happen overnight. And that's something that these brethren needed to remember, needed to understand. This is not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen overnight. But it is going to happen. And as far as God is concerned, he is going to bring down this empire, this world empire, the last world empire that would control the whole known world and enforce idol worship in its citizens. Never again will there be another. God took care of that. And in his plan, I will bring Babylon down. And if that's the case, kind of like 1 Corinthians 13, when Paul talks about love, but not without reason, in a context where all these things are going to be taken away, talking about the spiritual gifts, eventually there will be no more spiritual gifts. And if that's the case, what are you going to be left with, you who argue over who has the best spiritual gift? You're going to be left with nothing, if that's all you care about. That's why Paul emphasizes love and the sense of service to others, that's what those miraculous gifts were to be used for. Well, in the same way, once Rome is gone, once this enforcement of idol worship and emperor worship has been taken away, then what is that society going to be left with? Well, unless they are grounded and anchored in serving Jehovah, they're going to be left in the wind. And that's part of why this good news is being taught, because Babylon's going to fall. And if Babylon's going to fall, or Rome's going to fall, then what are you going to be left with when it's all said and done? You've put all your faith and all your stock in serving the gods of Rome and Greece, of serving the emperors as if they're living deities. And when it's all said and done, what are you going to be left with? Nothing. Jehovah's going to show his power and his authority over all of the false gods of Rome. He mentions verse 8, that hath made all the nations to drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And again, certainly the idea of wine, particularly strong wine, was associated with the service of idols, worship of idols, and certainly fornication and adultery was one of the means by which they kind of communed with some of their gods and some of this worship that they offered in idolatry. And that being associated with that, in contrast to the 144,000, where they're pure. Okay, in fact, they're referred to in verse 1 as virgins. Not literally, but in the sense that they haven't served false gods. They've given themselves over completely to Jehovah. They don't serve these false gods. Anything through verse 8? All right. And so here in verse 9, then we have this third angel. Another angel, a third, followed them, saying with a great voice, if any man worships the beast and his image, or receives a mark on his forehead or upon his hand, he also shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is prepared unmixed in the cup of his anger. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And this is one of the main reasons I'm reading from the American Standard, is because of this phrase, unmixed. And that doesn't really come across in the New King James, but this idea of the unmixed cup of his anger. I really want to focus on that, because notice how the declaration of this judgment is on Babylon, or Rome. Rome's going to be punished for what it's doing. And anyone else associated with Rome and its evil deeds are also going to be put to judgment. And that's the point of verse 9. Any man who worships the beast in his image. Remember, we talked before from back in chapter 13 how that you had these two beasts. Both of them served the dragon, which is Satan. But the first beast was kind of indicative of the Roman Empire, the government, the kind of the society of the Roman Empire. That second beast was kind of seemed to give it lend itself to the spiritual system of serving the false gods of Rome. That spiritual aspect of the temples and those who served in the temples, the priests and the priestesses and so forth, kind of that spiritual aspect. And it was that second beast that formed this image of the first and told everybody they had to worship it. And I think it's really interesting that we have examples of these emperors really starting with Domitian. Not that all the other emperors didn't have statues, but it wasn't until Domitian where it began to become the statues of the emperors were to be worshipped, or libations were to be offered before the statues. He insisted on being called a living divus, a living deity. It wasn't until Domitian that this sense of God on earth, or some aspect of deification of the emperors, really began in earnest. And it was after that, and there's even references to the fact that he insisted on being called Lord and Master, or Lord and it had the Lord and Master phrase had a connection to the deities, to the gods of Rome and Greece. So the idea here that if any man worships the beast in his image and receives a mark on his forehead or upon his hand. Remember, we talked about the marks. This is in contrast to verse 1, how that the 144,000, they have the name of the Son and the Father on the forehead. King James just has Father. But they have the name of God. Okay, they are identified. Remember, we talked about the forehead or the right hand, and how in that society, this is something that would be obvious. Okay, it's not written on the back, okay, or on the back of the head or something like that. It's something that's obvious. It's something that's easily seen. Well, if it's written on your forehead or your right hand, which was how people greeted one another, then it can be clearly seen. Well, just as the saints, their conduct, their character could be clearly seen in such an evil society. People who refuse to serve Jehovah, or refuse to serve the idols and insist on serving Jehovah only, that's going to be clear. Just in the same way, those who serve the beast, those who serve these false gods of Rome, those who serve the emperor worship and so forth, that's going to be clearly seen as well. So anyone who receives that mark, in other words, they've given themselves over to idol worship and to the worship of the gods of Rome, they are also going to receive the wrath of God. Verse 10, he shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God. And I think that contrast there from verse 8 is really interesting, because here's Rome, who's making the nations to drink the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Okay, well, this is God's judgment upon those who are involved in this. And she's making all of the nations. Rome is enforcing this in its society. But then in verse 10, he comes back to this concept of this, what this wrath means. The wine of the wrath of God, which is prepared unmixed in the cup of his anger. Really, in a lot of ways, this is a play on the idea of the worship to these false gods. Alcohol, strong drink played a huge role in those libations, in those festivities of worshiping these gods. It was a key component. So this is being used almost kind of as a play on words to say, you're looking at it as something that is wonderful and glorious and a way of worshiping your gods. God is using this imagery as a means of judgment. But the fact that he uses this term unmixed here, I think that's really interesting. In fact, Bob Harkrider mentions in his commentary that the third angel warns that those who share in these sins will be tormented forever, full strength, or the term unmixed. Without mixture refers to the common practice of diluting the wine with water. God's wrath will be poured out in full strength. And we've talked before a little bit about the concept of alcohol in the New Testament, and how there's two phrases. There's wine, and there's strong drink. Strong drink is never once ever considered okay. Okay, it is always condemned. Whereas wine, the way that it worked was it was usually 3 parts water to 1 part wine. And it was the idea of kind of purifying the water ultimately. Even though it had some of that wine in it, it was about purifying the water. They called it wine. But it was extremely diluted. And you see this in Acts 2. You remember when the Jews were saying Peter and the apostles were drunk? And Peter says, there's no way we could possibly be drunk. It's only the 3rd hour of the day. And so there was a reason why that is because it wasn't referencing strong drink. Strong drink is that which was undiluted. This is pure wine. This is pure alcohol. And this is what this phrase is, because that's the type of alcohol the Romans used in their worship to the gods. They didn't use the diluted, they used the real stuff, the full strength stuff. God says, you're going to use the full strength of worshiping false gods. I'm going to use the full strength of my wrath. That's why this term is being used here. Notice, he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. Notice, he shall be tormented, not destroyed. And that's a very important point to bring out here, because there are those who have taught in the past that hell doesn't really exist. It's a state of non-existence, that at Judgment Day, God's just going to snap his fingers and destroy you and you'll cease to exist. But throughout Revelation, a reference to continual torment, day and night, comes up. And this is one of those references. He shall be tormented with fire in the presence of the holy angels, in the presence of the Lamb. That's that sentencing. This is the judgments that's going to come. Thoughts and comments through verse 10. Then in verse 11, we see, and it should terrify all of us with regard to the concept of what awaits those who are condemned. The smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. They have no rest day and night. They that worship the beast in his image, and whoso receives the mark of his name. Does this sound like to you that it's just destruction and we cease to exist? He has no rest day or night. The smoke of his torment arises forever and ever. You know, Jesus himself refers to Gehenna, or hell, as a place where the worm does not die. Okay, that core of the human being, that soul, it doesn't die. It is stuck there in this place of torment. And kind of just the descriptive nature of verse 10 and 11, this is part of this warning. Yes, there's good news because there's a means to escape this judgment that's coming. But this is the nature of the warning. This is the nature of Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, knowing the terror of the Lord, we seek to persuade men. This is exactly what he's talking about, verse 10 and 11. the judgment that waits on all those who don't follow what God tells them to do, this is what waits. Thoughts or comments through verse 10 and 11? So then notice verse 12. Here is the patience of the saints, they that keep the commandments of God in the faith of Jesus. What in the world do the saints have to do with anything in this context? Why is this mentioned? Here's the patience of the saints, they that keep the commandments of God in the faith of Jesus. What does that have to do with anything?
We described it in the first set of verses up there.
Okay. So notice how this is kind of what helps us to understand the context. We're dealing with a contrast. We're dealing with 144,000, and where are they? They're being taken care of by the Lord. Okay, they're committed to serving Him. They may face smoke of torment. They may face, quote unquote, fire and brimstone, being tormented in the flesh on earth. But what's waiting for them? A home in heaven. Okay. The contrast is, while these individuals, therefore, who serve the beast, who worship the image of the beast, while they're involved doing that, and they're living it up on earth, what's waiting for them at judgment? The exact opposite. Torment and the smoke of their torment, no rest day and night. That's what waits for them. And so part of the reason why we have verse 12 here is kind of, and it's not the sense that anyone should glory or laugh and mock those who are going to be sentenced to fire and brimstone at Judgment Day. That's not the idea. But the patience of the saints, it goes back to knowing that God's plan is still active, that God's gospel, the good news that He is proclaiming throughout the world, is such that there is a way of escaping the judgment to come. But the patience of the saints, they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus, is such that they understand what waits for those who are faithful. That is their motivation. That is why when Jesus says, "Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life," that's what they have in the forefront of their mind. They are looking forward to that home in heaven. They're not going to be distracted by the pain and torment they may suffer on this earth. They're going to let God take care of the rest. They're going to let God take care of the vengeance. Remember, we talked about vengeance and revenge, how those are two completely different things. Revenge is seeking to get even, usually a malicious intent. However, vengeance is punishment for wicked living, wicked life. Well, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Not revenge, vengeance. God is going to deliver to all those according to their deeds. Well, the patience of the saints, they know what's going to happen as far as their deeds. They keep the commandments of God. They keep the faith of Jesus. They are faithful unto death. They know what waits for them. Anything through verse 12? Yes, ma'am.
I just looking up patience, wanted to see how it was used in Greek. And so I pulled it up on my strong definitions, and it says cheerful or hopeful endurance. So it's not just, it's the outlook too. It's not just, I'm waiting, let's go.
Yeah.
It's cheerful. It's, I'm okay, let's.
Yeah, and you're right. And that goes back to what James 1, consider it all joy when you fall into various trials. The endurance or the patience of the saints is that joy of looking forward to heaven. It's not happiness. We've talked at length about the difference between joy and happiness. Happiness is an emotion. Joy is a state of mind. It's a recognition that God's blessing me. But there's also a joyful outlook on the home in heaven waiting. And even though it may be an unhappy experience to go through trials and tribulations, to go through persecution, that doesn't take away the joy that is motivating them for that home in heaven, that crown of life. All right, verse 13. Then I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, "Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors and their works follow them." Sometimes verse 13 gets read at funerals where a faithful servant of God has passed away, and I think that's appropriate because that's exactly what this voice of heaven is intimating. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. That doesn't mean that before that they weren't blessed. It just means that those who die in the Lord, you look forward to that home in heaven. Because those who die in the Lord, notice that phrase, they die in the Lord. Those, they rest from their labors. Now, it's not that final rest, Hebrews chapter 4, that waits in heaven, but it is the sense of that rest from the deeds. They rest from their labors. They rest certainly from the persecution. They rest and now they wait. Their works follow them. And I think it's really interesting that on the heels of verse 12, as if there needed to be a re-emphasis on, well, why is this the patience of the saints? Why is this that they're so focused on this day, the Lord, where they will have a home in heaven? Because they know that right now, the stuff that happens in this world is not what's important. They're focusing on serving Jehovah. They're focusing on being faithful. It doesn't matter the persecution that they go through. It doesn't matter the trials that they have to face. They are going to look forward to heaven, and they're going to look forward to, if the Lord doesn't come back first, to death. Not because death in and of itself, but because that death then leads to this new life one day. They will rest from their labors. Their works will testify about how they've lived. Their works will testify regarding the mark on their forehead that it was of Jehovah, the name of Jehovah on it. Thoughts or comments to verse 13? All right, verse 14. So starting with verse 14, we have what sounds to be like two different harvests. And I want to be clear here with starting here with verse 14, that what we're talking about isn't the harvesting of final judgment. I want to make it clear that we're not talking about that. I want to look at this from a different perspective, because I don't think that's what John has under consideration, what he's seeing. Verse 14, I looked and behold a white cloud, and on the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, thrust in your sickle and reap, for the time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So he who sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, who had power over fire, and he cried out with a loud cry to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, thrust in your sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. And then we'll see here in verse 19 what happens. So if you read that and you think, okay, well, it sounds like what's happening is Judgment Day. Okay, Jesus is going to take those who are his, and then all those who are left, they're going to be the ones who are going to be condemned. But what's interesting about this is, remember our context, verse 13, isn't about so much Judgment Day, it's about those who die in the Lord. And then at the end here, when he says in verse 19, he thrust his sickle into the earth, gathered the vine of the earth, threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trampled outside the city. Blood came out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles for 1,600 furlongs. Winepress, that's not something that's associated with Judgment Day. Winepress has more association with physical judgment, not spiritual judgment. And remember, we're talking about a context of God bringing judgment upon Rome, okay, upon the empire for the deeds that they're doing, not only for their idol worship, their emperor worship, but also for their persecution of his people. Now, there will be a final judgment one day. But what seems to be under specific consideration is the physical judgment God's bringing, which then creates the situation of verse 14 linking to verse 13. I think it's really interesting, because when you say, okay, well, what's Jesus doing here? Notice what the angel says in verse 15. The time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. And so Jesus, he who sat on the cloud, thrust his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. And I suggest to you that these are those who die in the Lord as a result of this war against the saints. Not all the saved now going to heaven. It's those who are on the earth who are suffering and dying specifically because of this great war against the saints. The same great war that Daniel warns about in Daniel chapter 8. The same great war that Revelation's already spoken about, that Rome is carrying out on the people of God. All those who die who are faithful to the Lord. This is Jesus reaping those who are his, not to bring them to heaven, but rather they're still his, but now they're in paradise. And we talked about Hades and the two parts of Hades, place of paradise and place of torment. Well, these are those who are faithful to the Lord. That's in contrast to, again, through this physical situation, Jesus is going to take care of those who die in him. But then secondary to that, you have, verse 17, another angel comes out having a sharp sickle. But notice who's talking to this one, verse 18. This is the angel that came out from the altar. And this goes back a bunch of chapters, back to chapter 9, I think it was. Or no, it was back to chapter 6. About the angel with the altar of fire and how that he cast the coals of fire on the earth, showing forth this judgment of God on the earth. Not final judgment, but the sense of judgment of Rome. And I think it's really interesting that verse 18, we have that same imagery being used, again, suggesting the same context. That this isn't a judgment day situation, this is a physical judgment of Rome. And so this angel that's being described in verse 18, he had power over fire. Those are those fiery coals that were mentioned, that were coming up. Remember the incense that was burned, that were the prayers of the saints, and they were asking, how long will you wait? How long until vengeance comes upon these who've harmed us? Well, seems to be exactly the same imagery being used here in verse 18. That this is the angel who this incense of these prayers of the saints, how much longer until judgment comes upon Rome? That's kind of the fulfillment of verse 18. Well, now here, thrust your sickle, or sharp sickle, verse 18, gather the clusters of the vine of what? Of the earth. That's kind of in contrast to John 15. You remember what Jesus calls himself? I am the what? Vine, and you are the branches. Did he ever call himself, I'm the vine of the earth? No. Of course, we know it's a spiritual vine, because we're not literally branches, it's spiritual branches. Paul even alludes to that imagery in Romans 11 regarding the Jews and the Gentiles. Well, the same idea is being utilized here, that this is the vine of the earth. In contrast to Jesus, back verse 1, Mount Zion, this spiritual imagery being used, those saints are part of this vine of heaven, whereas these individuals who serve the beast, those who worship the false idols and worship the emperors, they're part of the vine of the earth. Well, that vine is tended by Satan, ultimately. But these individuals, they're a part of this vine. Now the grapes are fully ripe. Okay, these individuals, now it has come time for Rome to be brought down. And again, this is not happening overnight. Okay, this takes place over a period of time. But now is the time to bring Rome down. Now it's time to bring judgment upon this system that is in place, that is seeking to enforce idolatry over all the earth. And until 313 AD, that's exactly how it was. But then with the Edict of Milan, no longer was that allowed to be the case. And never again will it ever be allowed to be the case. Verse 19, so the angel thrust his sickle into the earth, gathered the vine of the earth, threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. I'm going to suggest to you that the vine of the earth specifically here is dealing with this idolatry. It's dealing with the system of Rome and its idolatry. Both kind of beasts together are what's being described. Now that's why I say Satan tends it, but it's not Satan himself. It is this method by which the earth was being filled with idol worship. Well, that's being thrown into the great winepress of the wrath of God. God is bringing his wrath. And remember, we're not just talking about vines. We're not talking about institutions. We're talking about people. Because what comes out of it? The winepress was trampled outside the city. Now, the city so far has been Babylon. Okay, so this idea of being taken outside of the city, even in the Old Testament, people being taken outside the city, it was a sense of impurity, of defilement, of shame. That's part of the reason why the Hebrew writer even references Jesus, who had to suffer outside of the gates. Okay, it was kind of a sense of shame that Jesus was taken outside of the camp of Israel and put to death. Well, here the winepress is trampled outside the city. It's something that's defiled. It's something that's shameful. Blood came out of the winepress. And notice the numbers here. Up to the horses' bridles is about 4.5 to 5 feet. But then 1,600 furlongs is 200 miles. 200 miles. And I think it's really interesting that several of the commentaries mention the fact that this provides what they call literalists, those who seek to read literally things in Revelation as if it's actual and real. 200 miles long of blood, 4 to 5 feet in depth. That's not something that's literally going to, especially the valley of the valley that's outside of Jerusalem, that's under, sorry? Yeah, well, it's called something else, the valley of, it is Gehenna is part of what Jesus was describing. Anyway, that valley is not 200 miles long. But that's part of what everybody wants to focus on is this valley and Armageddon and so forth, and yet that's not 200 miles long. So how is this going to go 200 miles and kind of provide this kind of river of blood? But the whole idea here is the judgment that's coming upon Rome. And it's physical judgment. God's going to bring it to an end. Now, that's not to say that there's not spiritual judgment as well. And personally, I think that's part of what some of this earlier imagery is of verse 10, 11, and 12. Okay, now some of the commentaries tend to be a little bit more specific. They think that this is more still kind of imagery of physical judgment. And certainly, I think physical judgment can fit there as well. But this is very spiritual too. Okay, there is a spiritual judgment certainly coming. The physical judgment is what's under consideration, though, for most of the chapter. That during the life of these saints, they're serving Jehovah. They know they can look forward to death because a home in heaven waits for them one day. But all those who serve the beast, all those who serve idolatry, they have physical judgment coming, but then spiritual judgment as well. All right, we'll stop there. We will pick up with our questions next Sunday, Lord willing. Thank you, everybody.